For thousands of years, Egypt has buried its greatest secrets beneath stone, sand, and silence. Pharaohs disappeared into sealed tombs, queens vanished from history, and even the final resting place of Cleopatra, one of the most famous rulers who ever lived, remains a mystery. But now, an extraordinary golden mummy has brought an old question back to life. Who was this person? And why was their body covered in gold? Was this simply another forgotten ruler of ancient Egypt, or could it somehow lead us closer to the lost tomb of Cleopatra? The truth may be far stranger than the legend, because behind this golden face lies a story of power, death, ancient rituals, and a mystery that has remained buried for more than 2,000 years. And if the clues are telling us the right story, we may be looking at one of the most fascinating secrets Egypt has ever revealed. Imagine standing inside a tomb that has been sealed for thousands of years. The air is dry. The walls are covered with fading symbols. Dust rests exactly where it fell centuries ago. And in the darkness, archaeologists discover something that should not be there. A human body, wrapped and protected with an extraordinary layer of gold, preserved so carefully that even after thousands of years, its identity seems to be waiting beneath the surface. Then comes the question that changes everything. Could this be connected to Cleopatra, the legendary queen whose final resting place has never been found? Could one of the greatest mysteries of ancient Egypt have finally been hiding in plain sight? Or is the golden figure evidence of another ruler whose name was erased by time? The answer may be buried beneath layers of history, and before we can understand the mummy, we have to understand why the ancient Egyptians were willing to spend fortunes preparing the dead for a journey they believed would never truly end. To the ancient Egyptians, death was not the final chapter. It was a passage, a transition from one world into another. The body might stop breathing, but the person was not considered completely gone. Their spirit still needed a place to return to. Their identity still mattered. Their name still mattered. And most importantly, their body had to remain recognizable. This belief transformed death into one of the greatest architectural and technological projects of the ancient world. Across Egypt, people built tombs that were more than graves. They were carefully designed homes for eternity. Inside them were food, clothing, jewelry, furniture, perfumes, weapons, religious objects, games, and sometimes even boats. The dead were not being sent away empty-handed. They were being prepared for an existence that the Egyptians believed could last forever. And at the center of this belief was the mummy. Mummification was not simply a way of drying a corpse. It was a complex ritual designed to preserve the physical body and protect the deceased from the destruction of time. The process could take around 70 days. The body was carefully treated, dried using natron, wrapped in linen, coated with resins and oils, and surrounded by objects believed to provide protection. The result could be astonishing. Thousands of years later, we can still see the faces of people who lived in a world almost impossible for us to imagine. But there was another reason Egyptian mummies are so important. They are time capsules. A mummy can reveal injuries, diseases, family relationships, diet, age, physical appearance, and sometimes even clues about how a person died. Modern researchers can examine ancient bodies using X-rays, CT scans, DNA analysis, and other technologies without necessarily destroying the remains. And no mummy has captured the imagination of the modern world more than that of a young king who ruled Egypt more than 3,000 years ago. Tutankhamun. When Howard Carter entered the tomb of the boy king in 1922, the world was stunned. Unlike many royal tombs that had been robbed over the centuries, Tutankhamun's burial chamber contained an extraordinary collection of objects. Gold, furniture, Chariots, weapons, clothing, jewelry, ceremonial objects, and the famous golden burial mask transformed an obscure young pharaoh into one of the most recognizable figures of ancient Egypt. But the real treasure was not simply the gold. It was information. Tutankhamun's mummy helped researchers reconstruct part of his life. Scientific investigations revealed evidence of malaria and serious problems affecting his foot. His family relationships were also investigated through genetic analysis. Suddenly, the boy behind the golden mask was no longer just a name carved into stone. He became human. And that is exactly why a mysterious golden mummy is so fascinating. Because gold was not simply decoration. In ancient Egypt, it had powerful religious meaning. Gold was associated with the gods, particularly with the eternal and incorruptible nature of the divine. Unlike ordinary materials, gold does not easily tarnish or decay. To the Egyptians, that made it an appropriate material for eternity. So when we hear about a mummy associated with gold, the first question should not be, is this Cleopatra? The first question should be, who was important enough to deserve this? Because Cleopatra lived at the very end of ancient Egypt's long history. She was not a pharaoh from the age of the Great Pyramids. She lived more than 2,000 years after the Great Pyramid of Giza was constructed. In fact, Cleopatra is closer to us in time than she was to the people who built the Great Pyramid. That single fact reveals just how enormous the history of Egypt really is. For thousands of years, dynasties rose and disappeared. Kings conquered foreign lands. Temples were built, abandoned, reused, and buried. Tombs were robbed. Cities were swallowed by sand and water. Names were deliberately erased. And sometimes, the dead were moved from their original resting places to protect them from thieves. Ramses II is one example. He ruled for approximately 68 years and became one of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs. Yet even his mummy did not remain safely in its original tomb. Like many royal bodies, it was eventually moved and hidden in a secret collection of royal mummies. When archaeologists rediscovered it in the 19th century, they had to reconstruct his identity from clues left behind on the wrappings. Imagine that. A king who once commanded an empire had become a body without a palace, hidden among other forgotten rulers. And that is one of the great ironies of Egyptian history. The ancient Egyptians spent enormous effort making sure their names would survive forever. Yet thousands of years later, some of those names have vanished. Some tombs belong to rulers whose identities remain uncertain. Some bodies were separated from their original burial places. Some were damaged by water, fire, looters, or careless excavation. And some remain wrapped because researchers believe opening them could cause irreversible damage. There is a mysterious lesson hidden inside all of this. The Egyptians believed preservation could defeat time. But time always finds a way to fight back. Even Tutankhamun's mummy suffered. When researchers attempted to remove the young king from his innermost coffin in the 1920s, they discovered that hardened resins had effectively glued the mummy to the bottom of the coffin. Heat was used. The coffin was exposed to intense sunlight, but the body remained stuck. Eventually, archaeologists resorted to extremely invasive methods. The mummy was separated from the coffin piece by piece. The body was damaged in the process. The head had to be detached from the mask. The arms and other parts were manipulated. Later, the remains were treated to stabilize them. Today, researchers have technologies that would have seemed like magic to Howard Carter. They can look inside sealed structures without opening them. They can scan mummies without unwrapping them. They can reconstruct faces digitally. They can analyze microscopic traces of materials and compare ancient DNA. That creates a strange possibility. What if the next great Egyptian mystery does not require archaeologists to destroy anything? What if the answer is already inside the mummy? Perhaps hidden beneath the wrappings is evidence of a royal bloodline. Perhaps the burial technique identifies a particular dynasty. Perhaps inscriptions reveal a name. Or perhaps the mummy belongs to someone history has completely forgotten. And then there is Cleopatra. For centuries, historians have known an enormous amount about her life. We know about her political struggles, her alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, her efforts to protect Egypt's independence, and the war that eventually brought her kingdom to its end. But the place where Cleopatra was buried remains uncertain. That is one of the most frustrating mysteries in archaeology. We know how her story ended. We just don't know where the final chapter was written. According to ancient accounts, Cleopatra died in Alexandria in 30 BC after the defeat of her forces by Octavian. Her death has been surrounded by legends for centuries, including the famous story of the ASP. But the exact circumstances remain debated. Her tomb is another mystery entirely. Was it hidden somewhere beneath ancient Alexandria? Was it inside a monumental structure that later disappeared beneath the sea? Or was it somewhere else entirely? One archaeologist has spent decades pursuing an answer. Kathleen Martinez became fascinated by Cleopatra and eventually developed a controversial theory that the queen's tomb may be connected to Taposiris Magna, an ancient site west of Alexandria associated with the god Osiris. Excavations there have uncovered tunnels, coins bearing Cleopatra's image, statues, and other clues that have kept the theory alive. But clues are not proof. And archaeology is full of discoveries that seem to promise one answer before revealing something completely different. That is why the golden mummy mystery is so compelling. If the mummy truly belongs to a famous ruler, the evidence should survive scientific examination. If it does not, then perhaps the discovery is even more important. Because history is not only about finding famous people. Sometimes the greatest discovery is finding someone whose name has been lost. A forgotten pharaoh, a royal physician, a member of an ancient dynasty, a person who lived, ruled, loved, suffered, and eventually disappeared from the written record. The sands of Egypt have preserved countless fragments of these lives. A golden mask, a broken inscription, a forgotten tunnel, a damaged tomb, a mummy waiting in silence. And somewhere among them may be the evidence that finally explains one of the most enduring questions surrounding ancient Egypt. Who was buried beneath the gold? And if the answer really leads to Cleopatra, then we may be standing at the beginning of one of the most extraordinary archaeological revelations in modern history. But before we can ask whether Cleopatra's final resting place has been found, we need to understand something far more fundamental. Why did the ancient Egyptians believe the dead needed to be preserved at all? Because the answer takes us deep into a world where death was not an ending. It was a journey, and every mummy was prepared for the road. Long before Cleopatra became one of the most famous women in history, the Egyptians had already spent thousands of years perfecting the art of preparing the dead. To understand why a mummy could be covered in gold, surrounded by treasures, and hidden inside a monumental tomb, we have to step into the ancient Egyptian view of death. To them, the body was not an empty shell. It was part of the person who would continue into the next existence. If the body was destroyed, the journey could become impossible. And this belief explains why the ancient Egyptians developed one of the most sophisticated funerary traditions the ancient world had ever seen. Look closely at the world around the Nile, and the Egyptian idea of eternal life begins to make more sense. Every morning, the sun disappeared beneath the horizon. Every morning, it returned. The Nile flooded, withdrew, and flooded again. Plants died and returned. Seeds disappeared into the earth and produced new life. The Egyptians were surrounded by cycles of destruction and renewal. Nature seemed to be telling them that death and rebirth were not opposites. They were connected. This idea became deeply associated with Osiris, the god of the afterlife. According to Egyptian mythology, Osiris was murdered and dismembered, but his body was gathered and restored. He then became ruler of the underworld. For the Egyptians, the story was more than mythology. It was a model for existence. The deceased could pass through death and emerge into another form of life, but only if the necessary rituals were performed. That meant the body had to be protected. The process began after death and required extraordinary care. The body was cleaned and treated, and the internal organs were removed in many cases. Natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture, was used to dry the body and reduce the moisture that allowed decomposition to continue. Then came the wrapping. Layer after layer of linen was carefully placed around the body. Resins helped bind and protect the wrappings. Oils and other substances were used during the process. Amulets could be inserted between the layers, each carrying a symbolic purpose. The goal was not simply to create a preserved corpse. It was to create a protected identity. The Egyptians believed that the deceased would need to recognize their own body. Their name, their face, and their possessions were all connected to their existence beyond death. That is why tombs mattered so much. A royal tomb could resemble a miniature kingdom. Food and drink were placed inside because the dead were believed to require nourishment. Clothing was included because the deceased still needed to appear properly dressed. Jewelry provided status and protection. Furniture created comfort. Weapons could serve practical or symbolic purposes. Even games were included. One of the most famous was Senet, a board game that was extremely popular in ancient Egypt. It may have been more than entertainment. Over time, it became connected with the journey through the afterlife. The message was clear. The dead were not being abandoned. They were being equipped. And the wealthier the person, the more elaborate the preparation could become. For a pharaoh, the funeral was a statement of power. The tomb had to announce that this was not an ordinary person. That is why gold became so important. Gold was rare, beautiful, and resistant to corrosion. To the ancient Egyptians, its qualities made it appear almost supernatural. It did not rust like iron. It did not decay like wood. It remained bright while almost everything else slowly disappeared. Gold seemed eternal. And eternity was exactly what the pharaoh needed. The most famous example is the burial mask of Tutankhamun. More than 3,000 years after it was created, the mask still looks astonishing. Its gold surface depicts the young king wearing the traditional royal headdress, with the cobra and vulture representing protection and kingship. But the mask is only one part of a much larger. Inside Tutankhamun's tomb, archaeologists discovered thousands of objects. Some were practical. Others were ceremonial. Some were luxurious. Others were deeply personal. There were chariots, walking sticks, clothing, jewelry, food, furniture, weapons, board games, musical instruments, and objects that reveal how the Egyptians imagined the king's existence after death. Among the discoveries were jars containing ancient beverages and baskets of food. The Egyptians believed the journey through the afterlife could be long, so supplies were necessary. Even the smallest objects could carry meaning. Perfumes and oils could preserve the body and provide pleasant scents. Jewelry could display wealth while also serving protective functions. Amulets were placed around the body because certain symbols were believed to repel danger. The tomb itself became a kind of map. Its walls could contain images and religious texts designed to guide the deceased through the underworld. One of the most important collections of these texts became known as the Book of the Dead. Despite its modern name, it was not one single book in the way we would understand one today. It was a collection of spells and texts that could help the deceased navigate dangerous stages of the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians understood that the journey could be difficult. There were obstacles. There were supernatural beings. There were judgments. And there was the possibility of failure. The deceased needed knowledge. That is why words were powerful. A name carved into a wall could help preserve identity. A spell could provide protection. An image could symbolically provide food. A statue could serve as a substitute for the body if something happened to it. Everything had a purpose. And that brings us back to one of the strangest aspects of Egyptian burial culture: the fear of being forgotten. To modern people, a name is often just a label. But to ancient Egyptians, the name, or Ren, was part of the person's existence. As long as the name survived, the person could continue to exist in some form. Erasing someone's name could therefore become an attack on their immortality. This is why some pharaohs later had their names deliberately removed from monuments. It was more than political vandalism. It was an attempt to erase their memory. Imagine spending your entire reign building temples and monuments to guarantee that your name would survive forever, only for a later ruler to order workers to chisel it away. That is exactly what makes archaeology so powerful. Sometimes the stone remembers what history tried to erase. A damaged inscription can reveal a forgotten ruler. A fragment of a coffin can identify a mummy. A piece of jewelry can connect a burial to a royal family. And sometimes, a scientific scan can reveal what no ancient inscription ever recorded. This is where modern archaeology has completely changed the study of mummies. Centuries ago, researchers often had to unwrap bodies to learn what was inside. That process could permanently damage the remains. Today, X-rays and CT scans allow researchers to examine the body while leaving much of the original wrapping untouched. Bones can reveal injuries. Teeth can reveal diet and disease. The condition of joints can reveal how a person lived. DNA can reveal family relationships. Even tiny traces of material can provide clues about where someone lived or how they were treated after death. The mummy becomes a scientific archive. And sometimes the information is unexpectedly personal. Tutankhamun's remains, for example, revealed evidence of serious health problems. His foot was affected by a condition that may have made walking difficult, and researchers found evidence associated with malaria. The young king who appears powerful in his golden mask may have spent much of his life struggling with physical limitations. That changes how we see him. He was not simply an immortal pharaoh. He was a young man living inside a complicated royal family, ruling a powerful but politically fragile kingdom. Other royal mummies have revealed equally surprising information. Ramses II lived to an unusually advanced age for his time and ruled for decades. His mummy survived not because his original burial remained untouched, but because ancient priests eventually moved royal bodies to protect them from grave robbers. This pattern appears again and again. The Egyptians built tombs for eternity, but they knew thieves existed. Royal tombs were filled with treasures, and that made them irresistible targets. Over time, tomb robbers broke into burial chambers and carried away objects that had survived for generations. Some bodies were damaged. Some were moved. Some were hidden. And some were completely lost. That is why an untouched mummy is so extraordinary. It means that somewhere, against all probability, a person remained sealed away while kingdoms rose and collapsed above them. The passage of time did not stop. The Roman Empire arrived. It disappeared. New religions spread across Egypt. Cities changed. Languages changed. Rulers changed. Modern nations emerged. And beneath the ground, the dead remained, waiting. That is the real mystery behind every ancient mummy. Not simply how it was preserved, but why it survived at all. And when the preserved body is surrounded by gold, the question becomes even more powerful. Gold tells us the person was important. The burial tells us what their society believed. The body tells us how they lived. And the location may tell us how they died. Put all those clues together, and archaeologists may be able to reconstruct an identity that vanished thousands of years ago. But there is one person whose identity has remained stubbornly out of reach. A queen whose political life is documented in extraordinary detail. A ruler who dealt directly with the most powerful men in Rome. A woman whose enemies turned her into a legend. And a queen whose final tomb has never been conclusively identified. Cleopatra. If her tomb is eventually found, it will not simply be another archaeological discovery. It could become one of the most important discoveries in the history of Egyptology. But before we can follow the trail toward Cleopatra, we need to understand the woman behind the legend. Because the Cleopatra remembered by popular culture is very different from the Cleopatra who actually ruled Egypt. And the deeper we go into her story, the stranger the mystery surrounding her final resting place becomes. For more than 2,000 years, one question has refused to disappear beneath the sands of Egypt. What really happened to Cleopatra, the last great queen of the Ptolemaic kingdom? Her palace vanished beneath the Mediterranean. Her tomb has never been conclusively identified. And the exact place where her body was laid to rest remains one of archaeology's most tantalizing mysteries. But now, imagine archaeologists opening an ancient burial chamber and finding something that looks almost impossible. A human body covered in a brilliant golden coating. A mummy preserved inside a royal burial complex. A figure whose appearance seems to whisper of wealth, power, and a civilization obsessed with defeating death. And then comes the question that changes everything. Could this be connected to Cleopatra? At first, the idea sounds irresistible. Cleopatra was one of the most famous rulers in ancient history. She spoke multiple languages, understood Egyptian traditions, negotiated with Rome, commanded enormous political influence, and surrounded herself with the symbols of royalty. Her final years were tied to Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, civil war, and the struggle for control of the ancient Mediterranean. But there is a problem. The golden mummy does not automatically belong to Cleopatra. And that distinction is exactly where the mystery begins. Ancient Egypt produced thousands of mummies, but only a tiny fraction were treated with the kind of extraordinary materials and symbolism associated with the highest levels of Egyptian society. Gold was not simply decoration. To the ancient Egyptians, gold was something far more profound. It was associated with the gods. It was believed to be imperishable. Unlike ordinary materials that decay, gold seemed to resist time itself. It did not rust like iron. It did not rot like wood. It remained unchanged while generations disappeared around it. And that made gold the perfect material for the dead. The Egyptians believed that the physical body was essential to existence after death. The soul was not simply released from the body and forgotten. Instead, different aspects of a person's spiritual identity needed to remain connected to the preserved body. If the body was destroyed, the journey into the afterlife could be threatened. This is why mummification became so important. The process was not simply an attempt to stop decomposition. It was a ritual transformation. The body was cleaned, treated, dried using natron, wrapped in layers of linen, protected with amulets, and placed inside increasingly elaborate containers. Every stage carried religious meaning. The goal was not merely to preserve a corpse. The goal was to create an eternal version of the individual. And for kings and queens, that transformation became even more elaborate. A ruler was not considered an ordinary human being. The pharaoh stood at the intersection of the human and divine worlds. In life, the king represented order. In death, the king was expected to continue existing in a transformed spiritual state. That is why Egyptian royal burials could become enormous architectural statements. Pyramids, valley tombs, mortuary temples, stone sarcophagi, golden objects, sacred texts, statues, offerings. Everything was designed around one idea: The king must not disappear. And yet, ironically, many of Egypt's greatest rulers eventually disappeared from the historical record in one way or another. Their monuments were damaged. Their names were erased. Their tombs were robbed. Their bodies were moved. And sometimes, their identities were lost completely. This is where the mystery of the golden mummy becomes so fascinating, because a mummy can survive while its identity disappears. A body may remain. The burial chamber may remain. The objects may remain. But if the inscription identifying the person has been destroyed, archaeologists can be left staring at an ancient human being and asking a question that has no easy answer. Who were you? And that question has haunted Egyptology for generations. Cleopatra presents an even greater challenge. Unlike some earlier pharaohs, Cleopatra lived during a period when Egypt was deeply connected with the wider Mediterranean world. She ruled during the final chapter of ancient Egypt's independent political history when Roman power was rapidly expanding. She was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a royal family of Macedonian Greek origin that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Yet Cleopatra deliberately connected herself with Egyptian traditions. She presented herself as an Egyptian queen. She associated herself with the goddess Isis. She participated in religious ceremonies. She understood the political power of symbolism. And unlike many members of her dynasty, she learned the Egyptian language. That mattered. Cleopatra understood that ruling Egypt was not simply about possessing a crown. It was about understanding the people who lived beneath it. She knew that religion, tradition, ceremony, wealth, and political theater could all be weapons. And Cleopatra knew how to use them. When she met Julius Caesar, she famously entered his presence in a way designed to bypass political obstacles and make an unforgettable impression. Later, when she met Mark Antony, she arrived in extraordinary style, using wealth, imagery, and religious symbolism to create the impression of something almost supernatural. She was not merely displaying luxury. She was controlling the story. And perhaps that is one reason her legend survived. Cleopatra understood something that many rulers understood instinctively. Power is not only about what you possess. It is also about what people believe you possess. Her image became part of her power. Her intelligence became part of her legend. Her relationships with Rome became part of history. And her death transformed her from a living political figure into something even more powerful, a mystery. After the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra by Octavian, the political world they had built collapsed. Antony died. Cleopatra followed soon after. Ancient writers later described her death as suicide, traditionally associated with the bite of an Egyptian cobra or asp. But the exact circumstances remain uncertain. And even more uncertain is what happened afterward. Where exactly was Cleopatra buried? Ancient sources suggest that Cleopatra and Mark Antony were placed together in a royal tomb. But despite centuries of searching, the tomb has never been conclusively identified. That missing tomb is one of the great unsolved archaeological questions of the ancient world. And it creates an irresistible connection between Cleopatra and every extraordinary royal mummy discovered in Egypt. Could one of them be hers? The answer, based on current evidence, is no. There is no reliable evidence establishing that the golden mummy belongs to Cleopatra. But that does not make the discovery unimportant. In fact, it may be even more interesting, because every unidentified royal burial gives researchers another piece of the enormous puzzle that is ancient Egypt. A golden mummy tells us about wealth. Its construction tells us about religious beliefs. Its burial position tells us about social status. Its physical remains can reveal information about age, disease, injuries, diet, and even aspects of daily life. Modern technology has transformed the way archaeologists study these bodies. Researchers no longer need to unwrap a mummy to learn what lies beneath the linen. Computed tomography can create detailed internal images. Three-dimensional reconstruction can reveal bones and organs. Scientific analysis can identify materials. Chemical testing can sometimes reveal where people lived, what they ate, or what substances were used during burial. Ancient remains are becoming historical archives, and this is where the story becomes much darker. Because the more technology reveals, the more we realize that ancient Egypt was not simply a civilization obsessed with death. It was a civilization obsessed with survival. Survival beyond the grave. Survival of identity. Survival of memory. Survival of a name. For the Egyptians, a person's name was incredibly important. The ancient Egyptian concept of the Ren, the name, was closely connected with identity and continued existence. If your name remained alive, some part of you remained alive. This is why pharaohs carved their names into temples, why they placed them inside tombs, why they surrounded themselves with inscriptions, and why erasing someone's name could become an act of political destruction. Imagine the irony. A ruler could spend an entire lifetime building monuments designed to guarantee eternal remembrance. Then thousands of years later, archaeologists could discover the tomb, but no longer know who was inside. That is exactly the kind of mystery that makes ancient Egypt so compelling. The desert preserves, but it also conceals. A tomb can remain hidden beneath the ground for centuries. A burial can survive while its identity disappears. A golden surface can shine after thousands of years, while the person beneath it remains almost completely unknown. And somewhere beneath the sands, the answer to Cleopatra's final resting place may still exist. Perhaps her tomb is hidden beneath an ancient settlement. Perhaps it lies beneath the ruins of Alexandria. Perhaps it is somewhere near the sacred landscape of Taposiris Magna. Or perhaps the tomb has already been discovered, but the evidence needed to identify it has not yet been recognized. Until that evidence appears, Cleopatra remains suspended between history and legend. We know she lived. We know she ruled. We know she fought for her throne. We know she allied herself with Rome's most powerful men. We know she lost the final battle. And we know she died. But we do not know with certainty where her final tomb is. And that missing piece changes everything. Because if Cleopatra's burial chamber is ever found, it would not simply be another archaeological discovery. It could become one of the most important discoveries in the history of Egyptology. The objects inside could reveal how Cleopatra wanted to be remembered. The inscriptions could tell us how she described herself. The burial could reveal how Greek and Egyptian royal traditions had merged during the final days of the pharaohs. And perhaps, after more than 2,000 years, the woman behind the legend could finally speak again. Not through ancient stories, not through Roman propaganda, not through Hollywood, but through the evidence she left behind. Until then, the golden mummy remains something different. Not proof of Cleopatra, but a reminder. A reminder that Egypt still holds secrets beneath its sands. And sometimes the most mysterious discoveries are not the ones that answer a question. They are the ones that create a much bigger one. Who was this person? Why were they covered in gold? Why was their burial constructed this way? And how many royal tombs are still waiting in darkness? Because if history has taught us anything, it is this: the greatest secrets of ancient Egypt were never truly lost. They were simply waiting for someone to find them. For thousands of years, the ancient Egyptians believed that death was not the end. It was a doorway. Beyond that doorway waited another world, one where kings could become gods, where the dead could reunite with their families, and where a person's name could survive long after their body had disappeared. But there was one terrifying condition. The body had to survive. And that belief created one of the most extraordinary traditions in human history: mummification. What began as a practical response to Egypt's dry desert climate eventually became a complex ritual involving religion, medicine, magic, architecture, and royal power. The Egyptians did not simply preserve bodies, they were trying to preserve identity itself. And nowhere is that idea more fascinating than in the mysterious golden mummies that continue to emerge from Egypt's ancient burial grounds. Gold was not chosen randomly. To the Egyptians, gold had a sacred quality that ordinary materials could never possess. It did not decay. It did not rot. It did not lose its shine. It seemed almost immortal. And anything that appeared immortal naturally became associated with the gods. Ancient Egyptian religious texts frequently connected the flesh of the gods with gold. This meant that covering a dead ruler with gold was not simply a demonstration of wealth. It was a transformation. The deceased was being given the appearance of the divine. The mummy was no longer merely a dead human being. It was becoming something eternal. This explains why gold appears repeatedly in royal burials. Golden masks, golden jewelry, golden amulets, golden coffins, and in some extraordinary cases, golden material applied directly to the body. Imagine entering a tomb after thousands of years. The air is dry. The walls are covered in faded paintings. The floor is buried beneath dust. And then your flashlight reaches the center of the chamber. Something reflects the light. Not stone, not bronze, gold. A human figure is lying silently beneath layers of ancient material. For a moment, it can feel as if the person died only yesterday. But then, reality returns. That body has been waiting for more than 3,000 years. And the person who once owned it has become almost completely forgotten. This is one of the strangest contradictions of ancient Egypt. The Egyptians devoted enormous effort to preserving their identities. Yet time erased many of them anyway. Kings whose names once commanded armies became little more than fragments of inscriptions. Queens who once ruled wealthy kingdoms became mysterious figures known only through scattered artifacts. Officials who served directly beside pharaohs disappeared from history until archaeologists uncovered their tombs. And sometimes, the tomb itself becomes the only surviving biography. One of the greatest examples comes from Saqqara. For more than 4,000 years, this enormous necropolis has functioned like a vast underground archive. Beneath the sand and stone are layers of Egyptian history, early dynastic burials, Old Kingdom tombs, New Kingdom monuments, late period chambers, Greco-Roman burials, different generations built on top of older generations. The dead were buried, forgotten, rediscovered, and sometimes buried again. It is almost as if Egypt's history was written vertically beneath the ground, and every excavation removes another layer. At Saqqara, archaeologists have discovered everything from enormous stone monuments to humble human remains. Some tombs belong to powerful officials. Others belong to priests, soldiers, craftsmen, and families. And some burials contain evidence that forces researchers to rethink what they thought they knew. Because ancient Egyptian society was far more complicated than the familiar image of pyramids and pharaohs suggests. The pyramids represent only one chapter. The civilization continued for thousands of years after the Great Pyramids were built. By the time Cleopatra ruled Egypt, the Great Pyramid of Giza was already more than 2,000 years old. Think about that. Cleopatra did not live close to the age of the pyramids. She lived closer to our own era. The Great Pyramid was already ancient history to her. For Cleopatra, the monuments of Giza were as distant from her world as medieval castles are from us. And that changes how we should imagine ancient Egypt. It was not one civilization frozen in time. It was a civilization constantly changing. Dynasties rose and fell. Religions evolved. Languages changed. Foreign rulers arrived. New technologies appeared. And burial traditions transformed with them. The golden mummy mystery sits somewhere inside that enormous timeline. To understand what a golden burial means, we need to understand the transformation of Egyptian religion itself. Early Egyptian burials were often relatively simple, but over time, funerary rituals became increasingly sophisticated. The dead needed food. They needed protection. They needed magical formulas. They needed objects that could serve them in the next world. And most importantly, they needed a body. The famous Egyptian Book of the Dead was not really a single book in the modern sense. It was a collection of spells and texts designed to help the deceased navigate the afterlife. These texts could be written on papyrus, painted on coffins, carved into walls, or placed directly inside tombs. They described dangers. They provided passwords. They invoked gods. They offered instructions. The afterlife was not imagined as a simple journey. It was a dangerous landscape filled with gates, creatures, judgment, and supernatural forces. The dead needed protection. That is why amulets were placed around mummies. Each had a purpose. Some protected specific parts of the body. Others represented gods. Others were connected with resurrection and regeneration. One of the most famous was the scarab. The scarab beetle was associated with Khepri, a manifestation of the sun god connected with rebirth. Every morning, the sun appeared to be reborn. Every night, it disappeared. And every morning, it returned. The Egyptians saw the same pattern in human existence. Death was not necessarily disappearance. It was transformation. This belief explains something that might otherwise seem strange. Why would people spend so much money and effort preparing for death? Because from their perspective, they were preparing for another life. The tomb was not merely a grave. It was a house for eternity. The deceased could receive offerings. They could enjoy symbolic food. They could continue their relationships with the gods. They could travel through the underworld. And if everything went correctly, they could achieve eternal existence. But there was another danger: robbers. Ancient Egyptian tombs were filled with wealth because the dead were expected to take valuable objects with them. That wealth became a target. Gold was irresistible. Jewelry was valuable. Statues could be sold or reused. Even the tomb itself could be stripped apart. This created an eternal conflict between preservation and destruction. The Egyptians built monuments to last forever. Humans came along and dismantled them. They sealed tombs. Robbers broke the seals. They hid mummies. Later, priests moved them again. And centuries later, archaeologists opened them. Sometimes the body survived. Sometimes nothing remained. And sometimes something completely unexpected appeared: a golden mummy. But even when gold survives, it does not automatically reveal the identity of the person beneath it. This is where modern archaeology becomes almost like detective work. Researchers examine the burial architecture. They analyze inscriptions, study the materials. They compare artistic styles. They investigate the mummy itself. They can estimate age. They can identify injuries. They can study dental remains. They can reconstruct aspects of diet. They can sometimes determine whether the person suffered from certain diseases. And increasingly, scientists can extract information from ancient DNA, although preservation conditions in Egypt make genetic research extremely challenging. Every clue matters. A single inscription can change an entire interpretation. A fragment of pottery can reveal a date. A particular style of coffin can narrow down a historical period. A chemical signature can identify the source of a material. And a name can solve a mystery that has lasted thousands of years. But what happens when the name is gone? That is where the golden mummy becomes almost haunting. The person beneath the gold may once have been surrounded by people who knew their name. Family, servants, priests, soldiers, officials, people who spoke to them, people who feared them, people who loved them, people who watched them die. Yet thousands of years later, none of those voices remain. The only witness is the body, and the body cannot speak. Or perhaps it can, because every fracture, every layer of linen, every pigment, every amulet, every inscription is a message. Archaeologists simply have to learn how to read it. And this is why the search for Cleopatra's tomb remains so important. Cleopatra was not merely a famous woman from antiquity. She was the final ruler of a dynasty that had controlled Egypt for centuries. Her death marked the end of an era. After Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra, Egypt became part of the Roman world. The pharaohs were gone as independent rulers. A civilization that had survived for thousands of years entered another chapter, and Cleopatra became the symbol of that ending. The mysterious golden mummy, therefore, represents more than a possible royal burial. It represents the larger question of how ancient Egyptians wanted to be remembered. Were they trying to become gods? Were they trying to preserve their families? Were they trying to defeat death? Or were they simply terrified of being forgotten? Perhaps the answer is all four. And maybe that is why these discoveries still affect us. Because despite all the differences between ancient Egypt and the modern world, one desire remains exactly the same. We want to leave something behind. A name, a photograph, a story, a monument. Something that says, "I was here." Cleopatra achieved that in a way few people ever have. Her kingdom disappeared. Her palace vanished. Her tomb remains lost. But her name survived. More than 2,000 years later, we are still searching for her. Still arguing about her death. Still studying her coins. Still examining her statues. Still wondering what happened to her body. And still looking beneath the sands for the place where her story may have ended. Perhaps one day, archaeologists will uncover a sealed chamber. Perhaps there will be inscriptions. Perhaps there will be a royal sarcophagus. And perhaps, hidden beneath layers of dust and darkness, there will be one name: Cleopatra. If that day ever comes, the world will not simply discover a tomb. It will open a doorway into the final chapter of ancient Egypt. But until then, the golden mummy remains a silent reminder that Egypt still has secrets. Some are buried beneath temples. Some are hidden inside tombs. Some are locked inside ancient bodies. And some have been waiting for thousands of years for humanity to ask the right question. Not simply, who was this? But something far more haunting. Why did they believe they could defeat death? There is something deeply unsettling about an ancient mummy. It is not a statue. It is not a painting. It is not a symbol carved into stone. It is a real human being who once breathed, spoke, loved, feared, and walked beneath the Egyptian sun. And then, thousands of years ago, that life ended. Yet somehow the body remained. Preserved, wrapped, protected, waiting in darkness. Now imagine that the body is covered in gold. For the ancient Egyptians, that would have meant something extraordinary. Gold was not simply a luxury reserved for the richest people in the kingdom. It represented something almost beyond human wealth. It was connected to the divine, to the sun, and to the idea of eternal existence. The gods were described as having bodies of gold. Their bones were associated with precious materials. Their divine presence was imagined as something that could never decay. So when an Egyptian ruler was covered with gold, the message was clear. This person was no longer simply human. They were being prepared for eternity. And that brings us back to the question that has fascinated historians for generations. Could a golden mummy somehow lead us closer to Cleopatra? The answer is still uncertain. But the search reveals something much more fascinating about the world Cleopatra lived in. Because by the time she became queen, Egyptian burial traditions had already been evolving for more than 3,000 years. Cleopatra was standing at the end of an enormous story. A story that began long before her dynasty. Long before Alexander the Great. Long before Rome became a superpower. And long before the first European explorers dreamed of finding Egypt's treasures. To understand Cleopatra's burial, we have to understand the world that existed around her. She ruled during the Ptolemaic period. The dynasty began after the death of Alexander the Great. When Alexander conquered Egypt in 332 BC, the Egyptians did not simply see another foreign invader. They incorporated him into their religious world. He was presented as a legitimate ruler and associated with Egyptian kingship. After Alexander's death, his empire fractured. One of his generals, Ptolemy, took control of Egypt. His descendants would rule the country for nearly 3 centuries. They were Greek rulers governing an overwhelmingly Egyptian population. And that created a fascinating cultural mixture. Greek language and political traditions existed alongside ancient Egyptian religion. Greek architecture stood near Egyptian temples. Royal families followed Macedonian traditions while presenting themselves through Egyptian religious imagery. And Cleopatra understood this better than almost anyone in her family. She was not simply trying to be Greek. She was deliberately presenting herself as an Egyptian ruler. She associated herself with Isis, one of the most important goddesses in Egyptian religion. Isis was connected with motherhood, magic, protection, and resurrection. Her mythology centered around the death and restoration of Osiris. According to the ancient story, Osiris was murdered and dismembered by his brother Seth. Isis searched for his scattered remains. She found them. She restored his body. And through her magical power, Osiris returned to existence. He eventually became ruler of the underworld. This story was at the heart of Egyptian ideas about death and resurrection. The deceased king could symbolically follow the path of Osiris. Death could become transformation. The body could be restored. The individual could continue living in another form. And Cleopatra understood the political power of that mythology. She did not merely rule Egypt. She presented herself as a living embodiment of Isis. That connection becomes especially important when we think about her death. Because if Cleopatra identified herself with Isis, then her burial would not have been an ordinary royal funeral. It would have been a carefully constructed religious statement, a final transformation, a passage from queen to divine figure. But where did it happen? That is the mystery. Ancient sources tell us that Cleopatra and Mark Antony were buried together. The Roman writer Plutarch described Cleopatra receiving permission from Octavian to make arrangements for Antony's funeral. He also described her being buried in a royal tomb. But the exact location has never been conclusively identified. Alexandria has changed dramatically since Cleopatra's lifetime. Earthquakes have struck the region. The coastline has shifted. Parts of the ancient city have sunk beneath the Mediterranean. Buildings were destroyed. Stones were reused. Entire neighborhoods disappeared. Imagine trying to find one tomb in a city that has effectively been buried beneath another city. That is the challenge archaeologists face. And this is why researchers have spent years examining locations outside Alexandria as well. One of the most famous possibilities is Taposiris Magna. The ancient site lies west of Alexandria and contains a temple dedicated to Osiris. Some researchers have argued that Cleopatra's tomb could be nearby. The theory is attractive because Cleopatra's religious identity was strongly connected with Isis and Osiris. But attractive does not mean proven. Despite exciting discoveries in the area, Cleopatra's tomb has not been definitively found. And this distinction matters. Archaeology is not about choosing the most exciting explanation. It is about following evidence. Sometimes a discovery seems to point directly toward a famous historical figure. Then another piece of evidence appears and changes the entire story. That has happened repeatedly throughout Egyptian archaeology. A tomb can look royal but belong to an unknown official. A statue can appear to represent one ruler but later turn out to belong to another. A burial can contain objects from several different periods because ancient Egyptians reused older monuments. And that brings us back to one of the most important lessons from recent discoveries. Ancient Egypt was constantly reusing its past. A tomb built for one person might later become a burial place for another. Statues could be moved. Stone blocks could be recycled. Old temples could be modified. Sacred spaces could remain important for thousands of years. The Egyptians themselves were fascinated by their ancestors. They looked backward. They restored ancient monuments. They revived older religious traditions. They deliberately connected themselves with legendary rulers from the distant past. In other words, ancient Egyptians were also historians. They understood that the past could provide legitimacy. A ruler who connected himself to an ancient tradition could claim continuity with Egypt's greatest kings. This is particularly important when studying the later dynasties. By Cleopatra's time, Egypt had already experienced periods of political fragmentation, foreign rule, conquest, and cultural change. Yet the symbols of pharaonic power remained incredibly strong. Cleopatra used them. Her image appears in Egyptian temples wearing traditional royal crowns. She was represented making offerings to Egyptian gods. She adopted the visual language of pharaohs. And that means her burial may have followed both Egyptian and Hellenistic traditions. A combination of worlds. A final monument to a queen who belonged to two civilizations at once. But what would we actually expect to find if Cleopatra's tomb were discovered? First, there would likely be inscriptions. Her name would be crucial. A royal cartouche identifying Cleopatra would provide the strongest evidence. Then there could be religious texts, images of Isis, images of Osiris, offerings, royal symbols, possibly references to Mark Antony, and perhaps something even more personal. Objects belonging directly to Cleopatra, jewelry, coins, ceremonial objects, fragments of royal clothing. Any of these could transform the mystery. But there is another possibility. The tomb could have been looted. And that is where the story becomes frustrating. Ancient tomb robbers were extremely effective. They knew where valuable objects were stored. They understood burial customs. They sometimes had access to the tombs through local networks. And royal tombs were obvious targets. A burial filled with gold was essentially a treasure chest waiting underground. Even worse, political upheaval could make tombs vulnerable. When dynasties collapsed, royal protection disappeared. A tomb that had once been guarded by soldiers could become completely exposed. This is why so many ancient Egyptian royal burials were robbed. The discovery of an empty tomb does not mean that the person was never buried there. It may mean the tomb was looted centuries ago, or the body was moved, or priests relocated the mummy to protect it. This happened repeatedly in ancient Egypt. During periods of instability, priests gathered royal mummies and moved them into hidden caches. One of the most remarkable discoveries in Egyptology was the royal cache at Deir el-Bahari. Dozens of royal mummies had been placed together in a hidden location. Some belonged to famous rulers. Kings who had once controlled vast territories were lying side by side in a secret chamber. Their original tombs had been abandoned or threatened. So priests moved their bodies. The goal was protection. And this creates another possibility for missing royal figures. A mummy may have survived, but it may no longer be where its original tomb was built. It could have been moved, relabeled, hidden, or even separated from its original burial objects. That is why finding Cleopatra's body could be much harder than finding Cleopatra's tomb. The tomb might still exist. The body might have been moved, or both may have been destroyed. There is another complication. Cleopatra was not buried at the height of Egyptian civilization. She lived at the very end of the pharaonic tradition. Rome was taking control. Political power was changing. The old system was collapsing. Her burial may have occurred during a period of extraordinary uncertainty. And yet Cleopatra still wanted to be remembered. That desire is visible throughout her reign. She built. She restored. She commissioned monuments. She placed her image in temples. She connected herself with gods. She created a public identity that could survive political enemies. Even after her death, her story survived the Roman propaganda campaign against her. Octavian had a reason to destroy her reputation. He needed to present the conflict as a struggle against a dangerous foreign queen rather than a Roman civil war. Cleopatra became portrayed as manipulative, seductive, excessive, and threatening. But beneath the propaganda was a highly intelligent political leader. She had managed to preserve Egyptian independence for years, while Rome's influence grew around her. She understood diplomacy. She understood economics. She understood symbolism. And she understood people. That is why the real Cleopatra may have been very different from the legendary Cleopatra. The golden mummy mystery reminds us of that distinction. A golden body can look spectacular. A famous name can sound convincing. But history demands evidence. Until Cleopatra's identity is scientifically and archaeologically established, we should remain cautious. The mystery is not weakened by uncertainty. It becomes stronger. Because somewhere between legend and evidence is the real story. And perhaps the most haunting possibility is that Cleopatra's tomb may still be out there. Not destroyed. Not lost forever. Simply hidden. Buried beneath layers of sand, stone, water, and time. Waiting for archaeologists to uncover the final doorway. And when that doorway opens, the question may no longer be whether Cleopatra existed. We already know she did. The question will be much more profound. How did Cleopatra want eternity to remember her? As a queen? As Isis? As the last pharaoh? As the enemy of Rome? Or simply as a woman who refused to disappear? More than 2,000 years after her death, we are still speaking her name. And perhaps that means Cleopatra already achieved the one thing the ancient Egyptians feared losing most. Her name survived. Her body may be missing. Her tomb may be lost. Her kingdom may be gone. But Cleopatra herself never truly vanished. She is still waiting beneath the sands of history. And somewhere in Egypt, perhaps behind a sealed wall no one has yet opened, there may still be one final piece of her story. For more than 4,000 years, the sands of Egypt have been hiding a strange truth. Ancient Egyptians knew how to preserve the dead with astonishing precision. They built tombs designed to survive eternity. They covered royal bodies with symbols of divine power. They surrounded the dead with food, jewelry, weapons, statues, spells, and gold. And yet, some of the most important people in Egyptian history simply disappeared. Their tombs vanished. Their bodies were moved. Their names were erased. And sometimes all that remained was a mysterious burial chamber waiting beneath the desert. That is why every new mummy discovery creates such excitement. Because beneath those layers of linen may be a person whose story has been missing for thousands of years. And sometimes the clues are stranger than anyone expected. A golden mummy is not just visually spectacular. It is a message from a civilization that believed gold could carry a person closer to the gods. But what if that golden body belonged to someone whose identity had been completely forgotten? What if the person was a royal figure whose name disappeared from history? And what if the burial traditions surrounding that mummy could reveal something about the final centuries of ancient Egypt? To understand this mystery, we need to travel away from Cleopatra for a moment and enter the world of another ancient Egyptian obsession: the search for eternal life. The Egyptians spent thousands of years trying to understand what happened after death. They observed the sun disappearing every evening and returning every morning. They watched the Nile flood, retreat, and return. Plants died and grew again. The desert seemed lifeless, yet the river valley remained fertile. Nature itself appeared to be following a cycle of death and rebirth. The Egyptians saw this cycle everywhere, and eventually, they applied the same idea to human beings. Death could be followed by rebirth. The body could be transformed. The soul could continue. But the process required preparation. Mummification became one of the most sophisticated funerary practices of the ancient world. The internal organs were carefully treated. The body was dried using natron. It was filled and wrapped. Amulets were placed between layers of linen. The face could be covered with a mask. And the entire body was transformed into a sacred object. For wealthy Egyptians, the funeral was a carefully organized production. Priests performed rituals. Family members brought offerings. Professional embalmers prepared the body. Texts were recited. And the deceased was presented to the gods. For a pharaoh, everything became even more elaborate. The king was not simply being buried. The king was being transformed. This explains why royal mummies can tell us so much. Their bodies preserve evidence of diseases, injuries, diet, age, physical stress, and sometimes even the circumstances surrounding death. One of the most fascinating examples is the mummy of Ramesses III. His body revealed evidence of a violent injury to the throat. Modern CT scanning showed a deep wound that had nearly severed his neck. This was not simply an ancient mystery anymore. Technology had transformed a centuries-old historical question into physical evidence. The pharaoh may have been murdered as part of a palace conspiracy. The famous harem conspiracy is described in ancient papyri. Several people close to the king were accused of plotting against him. For centuries, historians could only debate whether the story was true. Then modern imaging changed the discussion. The mummy itself appeared to carry the evidence. This is why mummies are so valuable. They are not just archaeological objects. They are witnesses, silent witnesses. And sometimes they contradict the written record. The same could happen if Cleopatra's remains were ever found. Imagine being able to examine her skeleton, her teeth, her bones, her age, her physical condition, perhaps even traces of diseases she suffered during life. Ancient writers described Cleopatra in contradictory ways. Some praised her intelligence. Others focused obsessively on her beauty. Roman propaganda portrayed her as a dangerous seductress who manipulated powerful men. But the physical remains could tell a different story. They could give us a glimpse of the real woman behind the legend. Of course, finding Cleopatra's mummy would be enormously difficult. The ancient city of Alexandria has changed dramatically since her lifetime. Much of the ancient landscape has been destroyed or buried. Some sections have disappeared beneath the sea. Earthquakes and tsunamis damaged ancient structures. Later civilizations built directly over older ones. Stones were removed and reused, and the coastline itself shifted. In some areas, archaeology literally takes place underwater. This means Cleopatra's final resting place may not be sitting safely beneath an untouched desert. It could be beneath modern buildings. It could be beneath layers of later settlements. It could even be somewhere beneath the Mediterranean. But there is another location that has attracted attention: Taposiris Magna. The site contains a major temple dedicated to Osiris. And that matters because Cleopatra's religious identity was strongly connected to Isis. In Egyptian mythology, Isis was the wife of Osiris. Their story centered around death, restoration, and resurrection. For Cleopatra, identifying herself with Isis was politically powerful. It linked her directly to one of Egypt's most important divine traditions. If Cleopatra wanted to construct an eternal image of herself, a burial connected with Osiris would have made profound religious sense. But once again, a theory is not proof. Excavations at Taposiris Magna have produced fascinating discoveries, including tunnels, tombs, coins, statues, and other artifacts. But no confirmed tomb of Cleopatra has been identified there. And this is an important lesson. Archaeology is full of exciting possibilities that remain unproven. The mystery becomes even more complicated when we consider ancient tomb reuse. Egyptians often reused older burial spaces. A tomb might begin as the burial place of one individual. Generations later, another person could be placed inside. Objects could be moved. Walls could be decorated again. Old statues could be transported. A later ruler could deliberately associate themselves with an earlier sacred site. This means that finding a royal burial does not automatically identify the person inside. Researchers must reconstruct the entire history of the chamber. Who built it? When? Who modified it? What objects belong to which period? Were the inscriptions original? Were the statues moved? Was the mummy relocated? Each question matters, and sometimes the answer takes decades. This is exactly what happened with many famous Egyptian royal mummies. Some were discovered without clear identities. Others were misidentified. Some had been stripped of their original burial equipment, and some were deliberately hidden by priests. Why? Because ancient tomb robbing became such a serious problem that priests eventually began moving royal bodies into safer locations. Imagine the scene. A group of priests enters a royal tomb. They see the remains of a king who once ruled Egypt. The gold is gone. The burial objects have been stolen. The walls have been damaged. The original resting place is no longer safe. So they carefully recover the mummy. They wrap it again. They write notes identifying the king. Then they transport the body to a secret cache. Centuries later, archaeologists discover the cache. Suddenly, dozens of rulers emerge from darkness. Kings who once commanded armies are lying together in one hidden chamber. This is one of the greatest archaeological ironies. The pharaohs built enormous monuments so that they would never be forgotten. But eventually, their bodies had to be hidden in secret because their monuments could no longer protect them. And this brings us back to gold. Gold may survive for thousands of years, but gold cannot tell us who owned it. Context is everything. A golden mask found inside a sealed tomb with an inscription is one thing. A fragment of gold found in a disturbed burial is something entirely different. That is why archaeologists are extremely careful about connecting spectacular artifacts to famous historical figures. The public wants names. The evidence demands patience. A golden mummy immediately makes people think of royalty. But ancient Egypt had wealthy individuals outside the royal family. High officials, priests, military commanders, elite administrators. Their burials could also contain extraordinary materials. Some individuals held enormous power even without being pharaohs. One example is the royal physician Teti-Neb-Fu. His tomb, discovered at Saqqara, belonged to a man who lived more than 4,000 years ago. He held several extraordinary titles. He was connected with medicine. He specialized in treating venomous bites. He was associated with medicinal plants. And he was also identified as a chief dentist. His burial demonstrates something important. Ancient Egypt was not simply a world of kings. It was a society filled with highly specialized experts. Doctors, priests, architects, engineers, scribes, astronomers, military commanders, administrators, and each of them could leave behind evidence that helps reconstruct the civilization. The golden mummy could belong to someone like this, a person whose name disappeared but whose burial still reveals status. And that possibility is just as fascinating as Cleopatra. Because history is not only the story of famous people, it is the story of everyone who helped create the world they lived in. The workers who built monuments, the priests who performed rituals, the doctors who treated injuries, the scribes who recorded taxes, the soldiers who fought wars, the craftsmen who created golden objects, and the embalmers who prepared the dead for eternity. Every mummy carries a fragment of that world. But Cleopatra's case remains uniquely powerful because she stands at the end of the entire tradition. Her death was not simply the death of a queen. It symbolized the collapse of independent Ptolemaic Egypt. After her death, Octavian became the dominant Roman ruler. Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire. The political world that Cleopatra had fought to preserve disappeared. Yet the Egyptian traditions continued. Mummification continued. Temples continued. The worship of Egyptian gods continued for centuries. Even under Roman rule, Egyptians continued to prepare their dead according to ancient traditions. And this is why the idea of a golden mummy connected with Cleopatra feels so powerful. It represents a civilization that refused to let death have the final word. The person dies. The body remains. The name is carved. The gold survives. The tomb waits. And thousands of years later, someone opens the chamber. Suddenly, the past is standing directly in front of us. Not as a story, not as a photograph, but as a human being. And perhaps that is the most haunting thing about ancient Egypt. The people who built this civilization believed they could defeat death through preservation. They were wrong in one sense. Their bodies eventually decayed. Their temples collapsed. Their kingdoms disappeared. Their languages changed. But in another sense, they succeeded. Because we are still looking for them. We are still reading their names. We are still studying their bodies. We are still trying to understand their beliefs. And somewhere beneath Egypt's ancient landscape, there may still be a burial chamber containing one of the greatest missing figures in history. Perhaps Cleopatra is still waiting there. Perhaps the golden mummy has nothing to do with her. But until every chamber is explored and every clue is understood, the mystery remains alive. And that is the strange power of Egypt. The desert does not simply preserve the dead, it preserves questions. And sometimes, those questions survive for thousands of years. Waiting for someone brave enough to open the door. Centuries, ancient Egypt has been a place where the dead seem to speak louder than the living. Beneath layers of sand, stone, and silence, archaeologists continue to uncover evidence that can completely change what we thought we knew about the people who ruled the Nile. But among all the discoveries, few are as unsettling as a mummy covered in gold. Gold was never just decoration in ancient Egypt. It was believed to be the flesh of the gods, a material that could resist decay and carry the dead into eternity. So when archaeologists encounter a mummy preserved in a golden shell, the discovery immediately raises a question. Who was important enough to receive such extraordinary treatment? And that question becomes even more mysterious when the discovery is connected to a period filled with political struggles, royal rivalries, secret burials, and powerful queens. Could this golden mummy belong to someone connected to Cleopatra? The answer may not be as simple as the headlines suggest. Cleopatra has become one of the most recognizable women in human history. Her name instantly brings images of palace walls, Roman generals, dramatic battles, and a queen who seemed capable of controlling the fate of entire empires. But Cleopatra was not simply the glamorous ruler described in later legends. She was a political strategist who understood the power of symbolism, diplomacy, and spectacle. She knew that in Egypt, appearances mattered. A pharaoh was not merely a politician. The ruler was expected to stand between the human world and the divine. Every statue, Every temple inscription, every royal ceremony reinforced that idea. Even death was part of the political system. And this is where the golden mummy becomes so fascinating. To understand why such a burial could matter, we have to step back from Cleopatra herself and enter the world of Egyptian mummification. The ancient Egyptians believed that death was not the end. It was a transition. The body had to be protected because the deceased still needed it in the afterlife. The heart, the organs, the skin, the bones, and even the person's name were all connected to the continuation of existence. That is why Egyptian embalmers developed techniques that were astonishingly sophisticated for their time. The body was carefully prepared, dried using natron, wrapped in layers of linen, and protected with amulets. Spells were placed between the bandages. Images of protective deities were added. The entire process could transform a human body into something that was both a physical remains and a religious object. But for the elite, there was another level: gold. The Egyptians associated gold with the sun and the gods because it did not rust or decay like ordinary metals. Its permanence made it the perfect material for the dead. A person covered in gold was not simply being buried in wealth. They were being transformed into something eternal. And that is why the discovery of a golden mummy can tell us much more than what was placed inside a tomb. It can reveal how the society viewed the person who was buried there. Was this individual a king? A priest? A member of the royal family? Someone who held enormous religious power? Or perhaps someone whose identity has disappeared from history? That final possibility is what makes archaeology so haunting. We know the names of some Egyptian rulers because their monuments survived. We know others because ancient writers recorded their stories. But countless people who lived, loved, fought, ruled, and died in the Nile Valley left behind no surviving name. Their tombs were robbed. Their statues were destroyed. Their inscriptions were erased. Their bodies disappeared. And yet sometimes, thousands of years later, archaeologists discover a single object that proves they existed. A golden covering, a fragment of a coffin, a royal seal, a forgotten inscription. One surviving clue can bring an entire life back into the historical record. This is especially important when discussing Cleopatra. For years, historians have searched for the queen's final resting place. Ancient writers claimed that Cleopatra and Mark Antony were buried together after their dramatic deaths. But despite centuries of exploration, the exact location of their tomb has remained uncertain. That uncertainty has created endless theories. Some researchers have suggested that the tomb could be hidden somewhere near Alexandria. Others have focused on sacred sites outside the ancient capital. And some archaeologists have explored areas where temples, underground chambers, and royal burials may have been connected. The problem is that Alexandria itself has changed dramatically. Parts of the ancient city were damaged by earthquakes and tsunamis. Some areas disappeared beneath the Mediterranean. Others were rebuilt over centuries. What was once a royal landscape is now partly buried beneath modern streets or underwater. Imagine searching for a hidden tomb when the world around it has literally moved. A palace that once stood above the ground may now be beneath layers of civilization. A temple may have collapsed. A chamber may have been sealed. And somewhere beneath all of that could be the remains of one of the most famous rulers in history. But there is another reason Cleopatra's burial is so difficult to trace. Ancient Egypt had already undergone enormous political changes by the time she ruled. The Ptolemaic dynasty was Greek in origin, yet it ruled Egypt using Egyptian religious traditions. Cleopatra understood this perfectly. She presented herself not simply as a foreign monarch, but as an Egyptian queen connected to the country's ancient gods. She even associated herself with Isis, one of Egypt's most important goddesses. This was powerful political messaging. If Cleopatra could be seen as the earthly embodiment of Isis, then her authority was not merely inherited through a royal family. It was sacred. Her death, therefore, needed to carry the same symbolism. And this raises an intriguing possibility. If Cleopatra's burial was designed to preserve her identity and divine status, could the discovery of an elaborately gilded mummy provide clues about the burial traditions of her era? Yes. But that does not automatically mean the mummy is Cleopatra. This distinction is crucial. A golden mummy can belong to someone who lived centuries before her. Ancient Egyptian burial traditions evolved over thousands of years. Golden coverings appeared in different periods and for different reasons. The presence of gold alone cannot identify a mummy. Archaeologists need evidence. Inscriptions, cartouches, objects found in the burial, the archaeological context, the style of the coffin, the materials, the dating of the tomb, and, when possible, scientific analysis of the remains. Without those clues, connecting a mummy directly to Cleopatra would be speculation. And archaeology becomes most fascinating when we separate what we know from what we desperately want to believe. Because sometimes the truth is even stranger than the legend. A mummy might not be Cleopatra at all. It might belong to an individual who lived centuries earlier and reveals something completely unexpected about Egyptian beliefs. Perhaps the golden body belonged to a priest whose status was almost royal. Perhaps it belonged to a child from an elite family. Perhaps it belonged to someone whose name was deliberately erased. And perhaps the most important discovery is not the identity of the mummy itself, but what the burial tells us about the civilization that created it. Think about what gold means to us today. We associate it with wealth, luxury, status, and power. The ancient Egyptians saw something deeper. Gold was connected to eternity. Stone could crack. Wood could rot. Paint could fade. Human flesh could decay. But gold remained. For a civilization obsessed with defeating death, that made gold almost perfect. So imagine standing inside an ancient burial chamber. The air is dry. The walls are covered with faded symbols. Dust rests on objects that have not been touched for thousands of years. And in the center lies a human form covered in golden material. The person beneath it has been silent for centuries. But the burial itself is speaking. It tells us that someone wanted this individual to survive beyond death. Someone believed their identity mattered. Someone spent enormous resources preparing them for eternity. And now, thousands of years later, we are still asking who they were. That is the real mystery. Not simply whether this golden mummy was Cleopatra, but why the ancient Egyptians were so determined to make sure their dead could never truly disappear. Because in Egypt, death was not supposed to erase you. For as long as your name was spoken, your image remained, and your body endured, a part of you could continue to exist. And perhaps that is why the search for Cleopatra's tomb has lasted so long. We are not only searching for a queen, we are searching for a name that refused to disappear. A name that survived wars, dynasties, earthquakes, political propaganda, and 2,000 years of silence. Cleopatra is gone. Her palace is gone. Her kingdom is gone. But her story remains. And somewhere beneath Egypt's ancient landscape, there may still be one final piece of that story waiting to be uncovered. A sealed chamber, a forgotten inscription, a royal burial, or perhaps a golden face staring back through the darkness. And if archaeologists ever discover a tomb that can be conclusively identified as Cleopatra's, it would not simply be another archaeological discovery. It could become one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of archaeology. Because after more than 2,000 years, the last queen of ancient Egypt might finally have a place to speak from again. For more than 2,000 years, Cleopatra has existed somewhere between history and legend. We know she was a queen, a politician, a strategist, a mother, and one of the most powerful women of the ancient Mediterranean. We know she stood at the center of Rome's struggle for power. We know her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony changed the political landscape of the ancient world. And we know that when everything collapsed around her, she chose death rather than becoming a trophy in someone else's victory. But there is one thing we still don't know. Where is Cleopatra? Not the woman in paintings. Not the queen described by Roman writers. Not the glamorous icon recreated by Hollywood. We mean her physical remains. Her tomb. Her final resting place. For centuries, the mystery has survived because the evidence seems to stop just when the story should become clear. Ancient sources suggest that Cleopatra and Mark Antony were buried together. But somewhere between their deaths and the modern world, the exact location disappeared. And this is where the story of the Golden Mummy becomes even more fascinating. Because every time archaeologists uncover an extraordinary mummy, the same question inevitably returns. Could this finally be connected to Cleopatra? The temptation is understandable. Gold, royal burial, ancient Egypt, a mysterious identity. Put those pieces together, and it feels like the beginning of a legendary discovery. But archaeology does not work like a treasure hunt. The most important clue is not always the most spectacular object. Sometimes it is something tiny, a damaged inscription, a piece of pottery, a seal, a fragment of linen, a chemical trace. Even the position of a body inside a tomb can reveal information about when and why it was buried. And that is why scientists are becoming increasingly interested in technology. The tools available to modern archaeologists are completely different from those available to the explorers of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Back then, discovering a tomb often meant physically opening it. Today, researchers can sometimes investigate an underground structure without disturbing the remains inside. Ground-penetrating radar can reveal anomalies beneath the surface. Magnetometry can detect changes in underground materials. Photogrammetry can create incredibly detailed three-dimensional models. And computed tomography can allow researchers to examine mummies without unwrapping them. A mummy can now be studied layer by layer without destroying the very evidence that has survived for thousands of years. This matters because the body itself may contain information that ancient texts never recorded. Age, diet, injuries, disease, physical appearance, even evidence of how the person died. The ancient Egyptians may have tried to preserve their dead forever, but modern science is now using that preservation to reconstruct their lives. Imagine what could happen if Cleopatra's tomb were found. The first question would obviously be identity. Is this really Cleopatra? But then hundreds of other questions would follow. How old was she when she died? What illnesses did she suffer from? Did she have injuries? What did she eat? What did she look like? What objects were placed beside her? Which gods were represented? And perhaps most importantly, what did Cleopatra herself believe her death would mean? We know she associated herself with Isis. That was not simply religious decoration. Isis represented motherhood, magic, protection, death, and resurrection. For Cleopatra, the association was politically brilliant. She could present herself as more than a monarch. She could become a divine figure. And if her burial followed this symbolism, her tomb might contain a carefully constructed message about how she wanted history to remember her. That message could be hidden in the architecture. It could be encoded in the placement of statues. It could appear in the inscriptions. Or it could be represented through objects that have not yet been interpreted correctly. This is one of the reasons Egyptian tombs are so valuable. They were not just graves. They were statements. A tomb could tell the living who the deceased believed they were. It could display their titles, family connections, religious beliefs, achievements, and relationship with the gods. The more powerful the individual, the more elaborate that statement could become. And Cleopatra understood the power of symbolism better than almost anyone. She was a master of presentation. When she met Julius Caesar, ancient accounts describe a dramatic entrance designed to bypass her enemies and gain direct access to the Roman leader. Years later, when she met Mark Antony, she arrived in extraordinary fashion, surrounded by theatrical imagery associated with the goddess Aphrodite. These stories may have been exaggerated by later writers, but the underlying point remains. Cleopatra knew how to control an audience. She understood that politics was not only about armies, it was about perception. And that makes her designed her final resting place with the same intelligence she used to manage her political image. It may have been an extraordinary monument. Perhaps it was deliberately hidden. Perhaps it was connected to a sacred temple. Perhaps its location was chosen to associate her with a particular deity. And perhaps its entrance was designed to make a political statement long after her death. But there is another possibility. The tomb may have been destroyed. This is one of the most frustrating realities of archaeology. Not every mystery has a hidden chamber waiting to be discovered. Sometimes, the evidence is simply gone. Alexandria suffered earthquakes, rising sea levels, flooding, fires, political upheaval, and centuries of construction. The city we see today is not the same city Cleopatra knew. Ancient buildings were dismantled. Stones were reused. Temples disappeared beneath later structures. Entire sections of the ancient coastline changed. And if Cleopatra's tomb was located in an area affected by these disasters, it could have been damaged beyond recognition. Even worse, ancient tomb robbers may have reached it long before modern archaeologists arrived. The idea of tomb robbers is almost inseparable from Egyptian archaeology. For thousands of years, people knew that royal burials contained valuable objects. Gold, jewelry, precious stones, ceremonial equipment. And even when a tomb was hidden, rumors about its location could survive for generations. Some tombs were robbed soon after burial. Others were looted centuries later. Some royal mummies were moved by priests into secret caches specifically to protect them. That is why discovering a mummy in its original burial environment is so rare. The golden mummy may therefore represent something incredibly important even if it has nothing to do with Cleopatra. It demonstrates how far Egyptian society was willing to go to protect the identity of the dead. And that brings us back to the mysterious royal tombs. Across Egypt, archaeologists continue to find burials that were never mentioned in famous historical texts. Unknown rulers, forgotten officials, priests, doctors, children, members of royal families. Their stories disappeared because history is selective. The ancient Egyptians built monuments for eternity, but eternity is not guaranteed. Political enemies could erase names. Later rulers could replace statues. Tombs could be reused. Religious traditions could change. And eventually, even the people who remembered the dead disappeared. That is why archaeology is sometimes less about discovering the past than reconstructing a memory that was almost completely lost. One of the most remarkable examples comes from Saqqara. This enormous necropolis contains thousands of years of Egyptian history. A person can walk through the area today and be standing above layers of completely different worlds. Old Kingdom pyramids, New Kingdom burials, late period tombs, Greco-Roman structures, Christian remains, and evidence of later settlements. It is almost as if the entire history of Egypt was deposited in the same place, layer after layer. And that is why discoveries here can be so unpredictable. A tomb may contain objects that were created centuries apart. A burial may have been reused. A statue made for one person may eventually end up in another person's tomb. A sacred place may continue to attract visitors long after the original civilization has changed. The past was never as neatly separated as modern history books make it appear. The Egyptians themselves were constantly interacting with their own past. They restored old temples, copied ancient religious texts, reused monuments, honored rulers who had died hundreds or even thousands of years earlier. In a strange way, they were archaeologists of their own civilization. And perhaps this explains why Cleopatra remains so powerful today. She lived at the end of a civilization whose history stretched back thousands of years. When Cleopatra ruled Egypt, the pyramids were already ancient. The Great Pyramid had been standing for more than 2,000 years. The temples of earlier pharaohs were already monuments of a forgotten age. Cleopatra herself was closer in time to modern humanity than she was to the builders of the Great Pyramid. Think about that. When Cleopatra walked through Egypt, she was already living among ruins of a distant past. She may have looked at the pyramids with the same sense of wonder that we experience today. And yet she could never have imagined that her own life would one day become part of that ancient world. She could not have known that people thousands of years later would search for her tomb. She could not have known that her name would survive while the names of countless kings disappeared. And she certainly could not have imagined that scientists would one day use machines to look beneath the wrappings of Egyptian mummies. But that is exactly what is happening. The dead are being examined again, not to disturb them, but to understand them. And perhaps one day, among all these discoveries, Cleopatra's final resting place will emerge. Maybe it will be beneath Alexandria. Maybe near a sacred temple. Maybe hidden beneath layers of stone that have already been walked over countless times. Or perhaps the golden mummy everyone wants to connect to Cleopatra belongs to someone else entirely. And honestly, that possibility may be just as fascinating. Because the real treasure of ancient Egypt is not gold, it is information. Every mummy gives us a fragment. Every tomb gives us a clue. Every forgotten inscription gives a lost person another chance to be remembered. And somewhere in Egypt, there may still be one final clue waiting. A clue that could transform Cleopatra from a historical figure into a physical presence once again. Until that day comes, the mystery remains. The golden mummy lies silent. The tombs remain buried. And beneath the Egyptian sands, history continues to wait. Because in Egypt, the past does not disappear. It hides. And sometimes, after thousands of years, it opens the door. For thousands of years, the deserts of Egypt have been hiding more than tombs. They have been hiding identities. A king without a name. A queen without a burial place. A physician whose body vanished. A prince erased from history. And perhaps somewhere beneath the ground, the final resting place of the most famous queen Egypt ever produced. Cleopatra. But there is something unsettling about the search for her. The closer we get to understanding how ancient Egyptians buried their most powerful people, the more complicated the mystery becomes. Because the question is no longer simply, where is Cleopatra's tomb? The deeper question is this: what would Cleopatra's tomb actually look like? And if archaeologists discovered it tomorrow, would we recognize it? To answer that, we need to understand the world Cleopatra lived in. By the time she became queen, Egypt was already ancient beyond imagination. The pyramids were not new wonders. They were ancient monuments. The temples of earlier pharaohs had already stood for thousands of years. The stories of Osiris, Isis, Ra, Anubis, and Horus had been passed through countless generations. Cleopatra inherited all of that. But she also inherited something else. A kingdom under pressure. Rome was becoming the dominant power in the Mediterranean, and Egypt could no longer ignore it. Cleopatra understood that survival depended on politics. She needed powerful allies. She needed money. She needed the loyalty of the Egyptian population. And she needed to convince the world that she was not simply another ruler fighting for a throne. She was Egypt. That is why her connection with Egyptian religion was so important. Cleopatra presented herself as a living manifestation of Isis. Isis was not only a goddess of motherhood and magic. She was the widow of Osiris. She was the mother of Horus. She represented resurrection and the restoration of order after chaos. For Cleopatra, this symbolism could not have been more appropriate. Her kingdom was surrounded by political chaos. Her family had been torn apart by rivalries. Her enemies wanted her removed. And yet she presented herself as the woman capable of restoring Egypt's greatness. Even her death could therefore have been part of this carefully constructed identity. According to ancient accounts, Cleopatra died in 30 BCE after the defeat of her forces by Octavian. Her death has been surrounded by one of history's most famous legends: the serpent, the asp, the Golden Queen choosing death rather than humiliation. But historians are not completely certain about what actually happened. The ancient sources disagree. Some describe a poisonous snake. Others suggest a prepared poison. Still others provide details that may have been influenced by later storytelling. The famous image of Cleopatra dying from a snakebite is powerful. But powerful does not mean proven, and this uncertainty extends to her burial. Ancient writers indicate that Octavian allowed Cleopatra and Mark Antony to receive a royal burial. That detail is extremely important. If true, it means the Romans did not simply discard the defeated queen. Her burial had political meaning. Octavian had won. Cleopatra had lost. But burying her as a queen allowed him to present himself as the conqueror of Egypt rather than merely the destroyer of its traditions. The tomb itself may therefore have been designed to reflect both Egyptian and Hellenistic traditions. That combination would make it unlike almost anything found in earlier Egyptian history. And perhaps this is why finding Cleopatra's burial is so difficult. She belonged to a dynasty that was Egyptian in appearance but Greek in origin. She ruled through ancient Egyptian religious traditions while living in a world increasingly dominated by Rome. Her tomb could have reflected all three cultures: Egyptian, Greek, Roman. Imagine entering a chamber where Egyptian gods stand beside Greek inscriptions, where royal symbols are combined with Hellenistic artistic styles, where Cleopatra's name appears beside the image of Isis, where Mark Antony's presence is somehow incorporated into the burial. Such a discovery could completely change how we understand the final days of Ptolemaic Egypt. But there is another mystery. What happened to Cleopatra's body after the Roman conquest? Ancient Egyptian royal remains were sometimes moved. Priests relocated mummies to protect them from thieves. Tombs were sealed and reopened. Burial chambers were reused. Objects were removed and replaced. Sometimes entire bodies were transferred from one tomb to another. So even if Cleopatra was originally buried in one location, her remains may not still be there. And that creates a terrifying possibility. The tomb could be discovered without the mummy. The mummy could have been moved centuries ago, or the burial could have been destroyed completely. But even then, the tomb could still reveal her identity, because ancient Egyptians were obsessed with names. A royal name written inside a cartouche could identify a ruler thousands of years later. That is why one tiny fragment of inscription can be worth more than an entire room of gold. Gold attracts attention. A name solves mysteries. And if archaeologists ever uncover Cleopatra's cartouche in a sealed royal burial, the debate would be over. No legend, no speculation, no guesswork. The inscription would speak. But what if her name had been deliberately erased? This is where ancient Egyptian politics becomes even more fascinating. Rulers sometimes removed the names and images of their predecessors. A person's identity could be attacked after death. Their statues could be smashed. Their inscriptions could be rewritten. Their monuments could be appropriated by later kings. To erase a person's name was more than destroying historical information. It was a spiritual attack. The Egyptians believed that as long as your name survived, part of you continued to exist. So removing a name could threaten the person's existence in the afterlife. Cleopatra's enemies had every reason to control how she would be remembered. Roman propaganda had already transformed her into a dangerous foreign seductress. Octavian's political machine portrayed her as a threat to Rome. Mark Antony was depicted as a Roman leader who had abandoned his homeland under her influence. The political reality was far more complicated. But propaganda survives. And sometimes propaganda becomes history. For centuries, people remembered Cleopatra more as a seductive figure than as the highly educated ruler she actually was. She reportedly spoke multiple languages. She understood Egyptian culture. She engaged directly in diplomacy. She managed a kingdom under extraordinary pressure. She used political alliances to protect Egypt. She was not simply a romantic figure. She was a ruler fighting for survival. And perhaps that is why the discovery of her tomb would be so important. It would allow archaeology to speak over the propaganda. Instead of asking what Roman writers wanted people to believe, researchers could examine what Cleopatra herself chose to leave behind. Her burial could reveal how she wanted to be remembered. That is a very different question. Now imagine the moment. Archaeologists enter a newly discovered chamber. The walls are covered in inscriptions. The air is still. Dust hangs in the beam of a flashlight. Then someone notices a familiar symbol, a cartouche. The hieroglyphs are carefully cleaned. The name becomes visible, Cleopatra. For a few seconds, nobody speaks. After more than 2,000 years, the woman who disappeared into legend would finally have a physical address. But then the scientists would face another challenge. They would need to prove it. Archaeology requires evidence. Dating techniques would be used. The construction materials would be examined. The inscriptions would be compared with known examples. Objects would be analyzed. The burial context would be reconstructed. And if human remains were found, researchers could potentially use CT scans and other scientific methods to study them. DNA analysis might even become relevant. But ancient DNA is complicated. Hot, dry environments can preserve some biological material while damaging other parts. Contamination is another challenge. And even if genetic material survived, researchers would need a reliable reference sample for comparison. There is no confirmed modern DNA sample of Cleopatra waiting in a laboratory. So the scientific confirmation would probably depend on multiple lines of evidence. That is how archaeology works. One clue is rarely enough. 10 independent clues pointing in the same direction can become powerful evidence. And perhaps the most valuable clue would be the location itself. If a tomb were found exactly where ancient sources suggested Cleopatra and Mark Antony were buried, and the architecture matched the period, and inscriptions identified Cleopatra, and the remains were consistent with the historical evidence, the case would become extraordinary. But until that happens, the golden mummy remains something different. A clue, a reminder, a window into a burial tradition that survived long after the people who created it disappeared. The mummy does not need to be Cleopatra to be important. In fact, it may help us understand why her tomb could have been constructed the way it was. It shows the continuing importance of gold. It shows the power of royal symbolism. It demonstrates how Egyptian beliefs about resurrection shaped burial practices. And it reminds us that the line between history and legend is often thinner than we imagine. The ancient Egyptians wanted to defeat death. They believed the body could be preserved. They believed names could survive. They believed offerings could sustain the dead. They believed the gods could restore life. And strangely enough, thousands of years later, they succeeded in one way. We still remember them. We still walk through their temples. We still study their mummies. We still read their names. We still argue about their mysteries. And we still search their tombs. That may be the greatest achievement of ancient Egypt. Not the pyramids, not the gold, not even the temples. Memory. Because the civilization that believed a person's name could preserve them beyond death has itself become immortal through the people who continue searching for its story. And Cleopatra stands at the center of that paradox. She was the last great ruler of Ptolemaic Egypt. She lived at the end of one of humanity's longest civilizations. Her kingdom disappeared. Her palace vanished. Her enemies tried to control her legacy. Yet her name survived. More than 2,000 years later, people still want to know where she lies. Maybe her tomb is hidden beneath the ruins of Alexandria. Maybe it is somewhere near an ancient temple. Maybe it lies beneath a landscape archaeologists have not yet fully explored. Or maybe it was destroyed long ago. We simply do not know. But every new golden mummy, every newly discovered royal tomb, and every forgotten inscription brings us one step closer to understanding the world Cleopatra belonged to. And perhaps one day, somewhere beneath the Egyptian earth, a sealed doorway will finally open. Behind it may be gold. It may be statues. It may be nothing but dust. But if that doorway carries the name Cleopatra, the silence of 2,000 years will finally end. And the last queen of ancient Egypt will no longer be just a legend. She will become a discovery. For more than 2,000 years, one question has refused to disappear. Where is Cleopatra? Not the Cleopatra of Hollywood. Not the seductive queen created by Roman propaganda. Not the woman surrounded by legends of poison, serpents, and forbidden romance. The real Cleopatra. The ruler who inherited one of the oldest civilizations on earth and watched its independence disappear. The woman who stood between Egypt and Rome. The queen who understood that power was not only held by armies, but by symbols, religion, wealth, diplomacy, and perception. And somewhere, according to ancient accounts, she was buried with the man whose fate became inseparable from hers. Mark Antony. Yet their tomb has never been conclusively identified. For centuries, explorers have searched. Archaeologists have excavated. Researchers have followed ancient texts. And treasure hunters have dreamed of opening a sealed chamber containing the final secrets of Egypt's last great queen. But perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether Cleopatra's tomb exists. It is whether we have been looking for it in the right way. Because ancient Egypt was not a civilization that simply buried its dead and walked away. The Egyptians created entire landscapes for the dead. Tombs were connected to temples. Temples were connected to rituals. Rituals were connected to gods. And royal burials were designed to create a bridge between the physical world and eternity. Cleopatra understood this world. She was not an outsider to Egyptian religion. She embraced it. She presented herself as a daughter of the gods and associated herself with Isis, one of the most important deities in Egyptian history. That means her final burial may have been more than a resting place. It could have been a final political statement, a monument designed to tell future generations exactly who Cleopatra believed she was. And perhaps that is why the golden mummy matters. Even if the mummy is not Cleopatra, it reveals the importance of preserving the body in a way that communicated status and divine connection. Gold was eternal. Gold did not rot. Gold did not disappear. Gold reflected sunlight. To the Egyptians, it was associated with the gods. So covering a dead person in gold was almost like saying that death could not truly destroy them. Their flesh might disappear. Their kingdom might collapse. Their enemies might win. But their divine identity could remain. And that idea was especially important for rulers. A pharaoh was expected to become something more after death. The body was not simply preserved as a memorial. It was prepared for transformation. The deceased needed their name. They needed their identity. They needed protection. They needed offerings. They needed rituals. And they needed the gods. That is why Egyptian tombs are filled with objects that seem strange to modern eyes. Amulets, food, weapons, jewelry, furniture, cosmetics, statues, religious texts, even ordinary objects. To us, these things look like archaeological treasures. To the Egyptians, they were equipment for eternity. And that gives us another clue about Cleopatra. If her tomb still survives, it may not look like a treasure chamber from a movie. There may not be mountains of gold waiting behind the door. Instead, the most important discoveries could be small. A fragment of a religious inscription, a royal symbol, a statue of Isis, a damaged cartouche, a ceremonial object, a piece of jewelry carrying Cleopatra's name. One small artifact could be enough to change everything. Because archaeology is not about finding the biggest object. It is about finding the right evidence. And that evidence may already be hiding somewhere beneath Egypt. The problem is that Egypt is enormous. Thousands of archaeological sites are scattered across the country. Some have been studied for generations. Others have barely been explored. Modern cities cover ancient settlements. The Nile has changed its course. Coastlines have moved. Buildings collapsed. Tombs were reused. And entire sections of ancient landscapes disappeared. Alexandria is particularly complicated. The city Cleopatra knew was a center of politics, science, culture, and commerce. Its royal quarter contained palaces, temples, gardens, monuments, and ceremonial spaces. But much of ancient Alexandria has been transformed by time. Some structures were destroyed by earthquakes. Some sank beneath the sea. Some were dismantled and reused. Others remain buried underneath the modern city. This creates a terrifying thought. Cleopatra's tomb could potentially be somewhere beneath the feet of people living their normal lives today. A street, a building, a parking area, a modern neighborhood, and beneath it, a chamber that has been silent since the 1st century BCE. If that happened, archaeologists would face an enormous challenge. How do you excavate an ancient royal tomb without destroying the modern city above it? This is where technology becomes essential. Modern archaeology is increasingly non-invasive. Researchers can map underground structures using remote sensing. They can create three-dimensional models. They can examine ancient walls without removing every stone. They can use satellite imagery to identify changes in the landscape. They can scan structures before entering them. And when mummies are discovered, medical imaging can reveal details hidden beneath layers of linen. The mummy itself becomes a time capsule. Bones can reveal age. Teeth can reveal diet. Wear patterns can reveal lifestyle. Trauma can reveal injuries. Certain diseases can leave traces. Even the way a body was prepared can tell researchers when and where the person lived. This means that if Cleopatra's remains were ever found, the discovery would not end with opening the coffin. That would only be the beginning. Scientists would spend years studying her. Historians would reconstruct her life. Archaeologists would analyze her burial. Chemists would study the materials. Medical specialists would examine the body. And historians would compare the physical evidence with ancient written accounts. Some stories would probably be confirmed. Others might be completely wrong. And perhaps that would be the most fascinating outcome of all. Imagine discovering that Cleopatra looked nothing like the glamorous portraits created centuries after her death. Imagine discovering evidence of a disease never mentioned by ancient writers. Imagine finding that her burial ritual was radically different from what historians expected. Imagine finding an inscription revealing a political decision that had never been recorded. A tomb could rewrite history. Because history is not frozen. It changes whenever new evidence appears. We have seen this happen before. Unknown kings have been identified. Forgotten dynasties have been proven real. Ancient medical practices have been reconstructed. Mummies have revealed diseases and injuries. Tombs have shown that ancient societies were far more complex than old textbooks suggested. The discovery of Cleopatra's tomb could do the same. It could change our understanding of the final chapter of ancient Egypt. Because Cleopatra was not simply the end of a dynasty, she was standing at the intersection of worlds: Egyptian religion, Greek culture, Roman imperial ambition. Three civilizations collided during her lifetime. And when she died, Egypt lost its independence. Octavian became Augustus. Rome became the dominant power. The Ptolemaic dynasty ended. The political world Cleopatra had known disappeared. But her story survived. That survival is remarkable. Many rulers who lived before Cleopatra had larger kingdoms. Some built bigger monuments. Some commanded larger armies. Some ruled for longer. Yet their names are almost completely forgotten. Cleopatra became immortal through a combination of history, politics, tragedy, and mystery. And perhaps the missing tomb is part of that immortality. Because as long as her burial remains undiscovered, the story has no final chapter. There is always another possibility, another expedition, another scan, another excavation, another theory, another hidden chamber. And every new discovery in Egypt seems to remind us that the ground beneath our feet still contains unanswered questions. The golden mummy is part of that larger mystery. It may never be connected to Cleopatra. It may belong to a completely different individual. But its existence reminds us that extraordinary burials were real. Royal identities could disappear. Tombs could remain hidden for thousands of years. And people who were once powerful enough to command armies could eventually become nothing more than a name waiting to be rediscovered. That is perhaps the most haunting lesson of ancient Egypt. Power does not last. Kingdoms collapse. Palaces disappear. Armies become dust. Gold loses its owners. But stories can survive. Cleopatra's story survived Rome. It survived the destruction of ancient Alexandria. It survived the collapse of the Ptolemaic dynasty. It survived centuries of changing religions and civilizations. And it survived every attempt to turn her into something simpler than she really was. Today, we are still searching for the woman behind the legend. Not the seductress, not the villain, not the romantic heroine. The ruler, the strategist, the Egyptian queen, the woman who tried to protect her kingdom while the greatest empire of the ancient world closed in around her. Maybe her tomb will be found. Maybe it will never be found. Maybe the golden mummy will eventually reveal an unexpected identity. And perhaps that is the beauty of archaeology. It does not always give us the ending we want. Sometimes it gives us a better question. The golden mummy may not be Cleopatra. The mysterious tomb may not contain a famous king. The sealed chamber may contain no treasure at all. But every discovery gives us another piece of the ancient world. And those pieces slowly rebuild a civilization that once seemed lost forever. So when you look at an Egyptian mummy, do not just see an ancient body, see a message. Someone wanted that person to survive. Someone wanted their name to remain. Someone believed that death could be defeated. And thousands of years later, we are still proving them right. Because we remember. We search. We investigate. We uncover. And every time an archaeologist brushes dust from an inscription, another forgotten voice returns. Maybe one day, beneath the sands or beneath the ruins of Alexandria, that voice will belong to Cleopatra. Perhaps a doorway will open. Perhaps a cartouche will appear. Perhaps beneath layers of stone, a royal burial will finally emerge from the darkness. And when it does, the world will not simply discover a mummy. It will discover the final missing piece of a story that began more than 2,000 years ago. The story of Egypt's last great queen, the woman who stood before Rome, the woman who refused to disappear, Cleopatra. For now, the mystery remains buried. The golden mummy remains silent. The tomb remains hidden. And somewhere beneath Egypt, history is still waiting for the right person to find it, waiting for the right inscription to be read, waiting for the past to open its final door. Because perhaps the greatest secret of ancient Egypt has never been the gold. It has always been the identity of the person beneath it. And until that identity is finally revealed, one question will continue to echo through the darkness of Egypt's ancient tombs. Was the golden mummy really connected to Cleopatra? Or have we been searching for the wrong queen all along? For thousands of years, Egypt has buried its greatest secrets beneath stone, sand, and silence. Pharaohs disappeared into sealed tombs, queens vanished from history, and even the final resting place of Cleopatra, one of the most famous rulers who ever lived, remains a mystery. But now, an extraordinary golden mummy has brought an old question back to life. Who was this person? And why was their body covered in gold? Was this simply another forgotten ruler of ancient Egypt, or could it somehow lead us closer to the lost tomb of Cleopatra? The truth may be far stranger than the legend, because behind this golden face lies a story of power, death, ancient rituals, and a mystery that has remained buried for more than 2,000 years. And if the clues are telling us the right story, we may be looking at one of the most fascinating secrets Egypt has ever revealed. Imagine standing inside a tomb that has been sealed for thousands of years. The air is dry. The walls are covered with fading symbols. Dust rests exactly where it fell centuries ago. And in the darkness, archaeologists discover something that should not be there. A human body, wrapped and protected with an extraordinary layer of gold, preserved so carefully that even after thousands of years, its identity seems to be waiting beneath the surface. Then comes the question that changes everything. Could this be connected to Cleopatra, the legendary queen whose final resting place has never been found? Could one of the greatest mysteries of ancient Egypt have finally been hiding in plain sight? Or is the golden figure evidence of another ruler whose name was erased by time? The answer may be buried beneath layers of history, and before we can understand the mummy, we have to understand why the ancient Egyptians were willing to spend fortunes preparing the dead for a journey they believed would never truly end. To the ancient Egyptians, death was not the final chapter. It was a passage, a transition from one world into another. The body might stop breathing, but the person was not considered completely gone. Their spirit still needed a place to return to. Their identity still mattered. Their name still mattered. And most importantly, their body had to remain recognizable. This belief transformed death into one of the greatest architectural and technological projects of the ancient world. Across Egypt, people built tombs that were more than graves. They were carefully designed homes for eternity. Inside them were food, clothing, jewelry, furniture, perfumes, weapons, religious objects, games, and sometimes even boats. The dead were not being sent away empty-handed. They were being prepared for an existence that the Egyptians believed could last forever. And at the center of this belief was the mummy. Mummification was not simply a way of drying a corpse. It was a complex ritual designed to preserve the physical body and protect the deceased from the destruction of time. The process could take around 70 days. The body was carefully treated, dried using natron, wrapped in linen, coated with resins and oils, and surrounded by objects believed to provide protection. The result could be astonishing. Thousands of years later, we can still see the faces of people who lived in a world almost impossible for us to imagine. But there was another reason Egyptian mummies are so important. They are time capsules. A mummy can reveal injuries, diseases, family relationships, diet, age, physical appearance, and sometimes even clues about how a person died. Modern researchers can examine ancient bodies using X-rays, CT scans, DNA analysis, and other technologies without necessarily destroying the remains. And no mummy has captured the imagination of the modern world more than that of a young king who ruled Egypt more than 3,000 years ago. Tutankhamun. When Howard Carter entered the tomb of the boy king in 1922, the world was stunned. Unlike many royal tombs that had been robbed over the centuries, Tutankhamun's burial chamber contained an extraordinary collection of objects. Gold, furniture, chariots, weapons, clothing, jewelry, ceremonial objects, and the famous golden burial mask transformed an obscure young pharaoh into one of the most recognizable figures of ancient Egypt. But the real treasure was not simply the gold. It was information. Tutankhamun's mummy helped researchers reconstruct part of his life. Scientific investigations revealed evidence of malaria and serious problems affecting his foot. His family relationships were also investigated through genetic analysis. Suddenly, the boy behind the golden mask was no longer just a name carved into stone. He became human. And that is exactly why a mysterious golden mummy is so fascinating. Because gold was not simply decoration. In ancient Egypt, it had powerful religious meaning. Gold was associated with the gods, particularly with the eternal and incorruptible nature of the divine. Unlike ordinary materials, gold does not easily tarnish or decay. To the Egyptians, that made it an appropriate material for eternity. So when we hear about a mummy associated with gold, the first question should not be, is this Cleopatra? The first question should be, who was important enough to deserve this? Because Cleopatra lived at the very end of ancient Egypt's long history. She was not a pharaoh from the age of the Great Pyramids. She lived more than 2,000 years after the Great Pyramid of Giza was constructed. In fact, Cleopatra is closer to us in time than she was to the people who built the Great Pyramid. That single fact reveals just how enormous the history of Egypt really is. For thousands of years, dynasties rose and disappeared. Kings conquered foreign lands. Temples were built, abandoned, reused, and buried. Tombs were robbed. Cities were swallowed by sand and water. Names were deliberately erased. And sometimes, the dead were moved from their original resting places to protect them from thieves. Ramses II is one example. He ruled for approximately 68 years and became one of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs. Yet even his mummy did not remain safely in its original tomb. Like many royal bodies, it was eventually moved and hidden in a secret collection of royal mummies. When archaeologists rediscovered it in the 19th century, they had to reconstruct his identity from clues left behind on the wrappings. Imagine that. A king who once commanded an empire had become a body without a palace, hidden among other forgotten rulers. And that is one of the great ironies of Egyptian history. The ancient Egyptians spent enormous effort making sure their names would survive forever. Yet thousands of years later, some of those names have vanished. Some tombs belong to rulers whose identities remain uncertain. Some bodies were separated from their original burial places. Some were damaged by water, fire, looters, or careless excavation. And some remain wrapped because researchers believe opening them could cause irreversible damage. There is a mysterious lesson hidden inside all of this. The Egyptians believed preservation could defeat time. But time always finds a way to fight back. Even Tutankhamun's mummy suffered. When researchers attempted to remove the young king from his innermost coffin in the 1920s, they discovered that hardened resins had effectively glued the mummy to the bottom of the coffin. Heat was used. The coffin was exposed to intense sunlight, but the body remained stuck. Eventually, archaeologists resorted to extremely invasive methods. The mummy was separated from the coffin piece by piece. The body was damaged in the process. The head had to be detached from the mask. The arms and other parts were manipulated. Later, the remains were treated to stabilize them. Today, researchers have technologies that would have seemed like magic to